Midsommar is the second feature from writer and director Ari Aster, the first one being Hereditary, which was released last summer. When he made his debut with that film last year, it was easy to say that he made the most audacious, ambitious, and possibly the most successful debut of any filmmaker that year. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that he made a horror film that is so good that most filmmakers would kill to probably make something that good, let alone for their first feature. Despite how controversial it might have been for mainstream audiences, it definitely made an impact at the box office and also was very influential to people in how they perceive horror, and also in terms of getting people to look more at the indie film market versus just the regular things that studios produce. Now, with the second film, Midsommar, I expect that will continue to be the case. Ari Aster's filmmaking continue to divide audiences and point people in a direction towards films that they might not be used to. And with that, the story of Midsommar follows a young woman portrayed by Florence Pugh who suffered a hugely traumatic experience in her life. And sometime after that occurs, she goes on a trip with her boyfriend and a few of his other friends to Sweden for a summer vacation. These guys are reluctant to bring her along because they preferred to have a guys-only trip and didn't really want to have not only a girl there, but also someone who had personal problems bringing baggage along with her. But needless to say, they all go on this vacation to northern Sweden for a festival that takes place every 90 years. Soon after arriving, they find that a lot of sinister things are going on, and now we have yet another controversial and very disturbing horror film from Ari Aster. Before I continue with my thoughts, I should say that despite how incredibly disturbing and just affecting Hereditary was, I loved that film so much that it ended up on my top 10 list for last year, and it immediately launched Ari Aster to the top of my list of directors who I wanted to follow and see what else they did. Naturally, with the fact that Ari Aster made another ambitious horror film in the following year that Hereditary came out was astonishing to me, especially given how gorgeous it looks. Without a doubt, this is one of the best looking films I've seen all year, just with its cinematography, the editing, the way that the camera shots move and in a specific rhythm. There are a lot of horror films that rely on quick cuts or either just very bland cinematography just to rush into sequences of jump scares or don't really have anything of real substance behind what's going on. With Midsommar, I can definitely tell that Ari Aster wasn't just phoning in another horror film just to continue a trend of what he was doing. A lot of care and a lot of detail was put into every single frame of this movie. Particularly in that, you'll find subtle details in certain frames that play into how things go on later. And if you really are paying attention to how this film is constructed, I think that'll be very rewarding to see certain things and then eventually get resolved or just come back later on to bring in another horrifying sequence. And yet again, this is another deeply disturbing horror film that I think a lot of people will get satisfaction from, and a lot of people already have been. When you have a horror film that is set pretty much 99% in daylight, you would expect there to be a different approach to horror than simply relying on something bumping in the night or a creepy individual waiting around the corner for some unsuspecting individual. This is definitely a different brand of horror than what people are used to. This is much more in line with cultish folk tales and just a lot of insane things that people do. You could definitely say that this film relies on themes of dark deeds that people do and just the evil side of humanity. But also, Midsommar can be interpreted as a story of a breakup, albeit a darkly comic one at that. But the way that the story ultimately plays out and the direction that it takes, especially with the main characters portrayed wonderfully by Reynor and Florence Pugh, you can see that the director is trying to make a point with those characters. And there's a through line that goes from the beginning to the end about how people navigate their relationships, especially millennials nowadays. I think if anyone was going to take something of substance away from the movie, that's probably the main thing, because as the title of this review suggests, a lot to show, not enough to tell. I feel that Midsommar does amazing things in terms of its visuals, and also a lot of the specific things that Ari Aster does with the subtleties of the performances, but ultimately I want a good story out of a horror film in order for me to feel the threat of whatever is taking place. That does not mean I always need dialogue-driven sequences to keep me engaged. I mean, some of my favorite movies of the past few years are completely driven by visuals, like with A Ghost Story or Upstream Color. Midsommar isn't like that, but it definitely relies a lot on shock value and then just long, drawn-out visual sequences of terror and dread, which will definitely be affecting for some, especially since this film feels a lot like a drug-fueled fever dream. But for me, I didn't necessarily get much out of that, because whereas Hereditary went just absolutely insane in the last 15 minutes of its runtime, Midsommar kind of does that pretty much for its last hour. And up until that point, I didn't really feel like the story was heading in a direction that personally sucked me in terms of what I seek after in a film for its emotional core. There were definitely threads that Ari Aster was setting up from the beginning in terms of the tragedy that befalls the main character, or other minor subplots with the guys that come along for the trip, and a lot of those don't get resolved. Part of the reason for that might be that Ari Aster initially wanted this to be a slasher film set in Sweden, but along the way that got changed into this more long and drawn out film about cultish horror. If that film was originally released where it was kind of more about every single person eventually getting killed off by another, I think those subplots wouldn't have mattered to me as much, because you expect that in slasher films, where you have minor characters that are simply there just to be killed and nothing else. But due to the way this film set itself up, this seemed to be much more of a story-driven horror film than just one of shock value. And eventually with where this film leads, when it kind of transfers to a lot more of the visceral type of horror that we see instead of more story-based, I felt very underwhelmed by the direction that it took. And even when there were a lot of disturbing and very frightening things that were going on, I personally just wasn't invested. There was a lot of opportunity for Ari Aster to wrap me in with its emotional story, especially in terms of taking the main character's trauma and making that a point of her character. But later on, that part of her story doesn't even matter. From the outset, her trauma is basically just used to get us on her side and to kind of put us in her headspace a little bit. But the movie doesn't do much from then on to really take us on a journey with her. In fact, that's kind of the case for most of the characters. I'd say the one that gets the most development is probably Jack Reynor's character. He might not be the most likable character in the movie, but I would say that his development from where he is in the beginning to the end is the most realistic, because a lot more time was spent on helping us understand where his headspace was and also just where he wanted to go. You understand his motivations completely, even though they are definitely scrambled and morally complex. And I felt most connected to him just because, not only for the fact that he's a guy, but because just for the simple fact that the screenplay took enough time to actually flesh out his character. Whereas for other characters where that would have been important, the story just doesn't really focus on them as much. Now, for those of you who appreciated this movie for the simple fact that it is a visual treat, if you loved it for that simple reason and appreciate the filmmaking like I did, then you're going to have a great time with it, and I'm sure that a lot of you who have experienced this movie already probably loved it for those exact reasons. For me though, if I'm going to compare Midsommar to Hereditary like so many other people had, even though both films are very similar in terms of their shot composition, the way that each scene moves from one to the next, and certainly the focus on practical horror versus just a lot of CGI and jump scares, where Hereditary made the huge difference for me is that it was a story about a family, one that was charged by emotions from beginning to end, and with the characters that you were involved with, each of them had their own arc, and they all had a development that made sense, and I was able to place my emotions in their situation. I was able to feel the tragedy of what they experienced, and because of that, when the horror truly started to kick into the story, I felt terrified because the characters were in those situations. I can't just have frightening imagery to be satisfied. When I watch a horror film, my level of scares is almost always dependent on what the characters are experiencing first, and whether or not I care whether or not they'll get out of that situation. That's a key reason why I loved Hereditary, like I said, but also A Quiet Place from last year, which people had a lot of problems with. But since I was able to get on a similar plane as the family in that movie, that's why I was able to get invested in the suspense of the whole entire thing. With Midsommar, despite how incredibly well made it is, and I appreciate the time and the craft that was at place, I simply just had no investment in what was going on. It's not a bad movie per se, and I completely understand the points by those who say it's one of the best movies of the year. For me though, I feel no need to watch it again, and I was pretty disappointed, to be honest with you. With that, I am giving Midsommar a C+. As far as an age recommendation goes, this is 100% for adults only. Even though the language wasn't as strong as I expected, a lot of the reason why I give it an adult-only rating for 18 plus is because the violence is very disturbing when it's shown. I'm not going to go into details in terms of the violence of what happens, but I will say that you are going to see mutilated corpses. You are going to see people falling from their death and the impact that their bodies face when they hit the ground, and you're going to see some very frightening, disturbing images of just things that people do to each other too. Like Hereditary, there are images in this movie that I'll never be able to remove from my head, simply because of just the insane things that were shown. And also there's a scene towards the end that gets quite sexual. I chose to not watch it for that exact reason, but if you want more details on it, just look it up on Common Sense Media or something. But yeah, because of the blend of violence and sexual content in this movie and the nature of it, this is definitely for adults only, 18 plus, strongly recommended. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know that my opinion on Midsommar is not necessarily with what most people are saying, but I gotta be honest here in my videos, and I appreciate you taking the time to hear what I had to say. Look forward to more reviews coming soon, and if you like this content, please check out my Facebook, Letterboxd, and Instagram pages and the links in the description below to find content you normally won't find here on YouTube. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good one.